The unipolar world, as the name suggests, involves one global hegemon that acts as the singular, unchallenged superpower. The unipolar world of the modern eras lasted from 1992 until the present, but also arguably until 2021 with the US withdrawal from Afghanistan and fall of Kabul, which ignited global overt challenges to US hegemony. Keep in mind that, similar to my multipolar and bipolar world videos, this is a very brief summary and not all cases will be included. Additionally, cases will be summarized and conflicts are more complex than you will see in this video, as I'm only giving out the basics for the purposes of this video. And with that, on to the video of the unipolar world. The fall of the Warsaw Pact came in 1989 and the Soviet Union fell in 1991. The world was lucky that the Soviet bloc imploded instead of exploded as they collapsed. This left America as the one remaining global superpower and the victor of the Cold War. The Gulf War saw the US lead an international UN coalition against Saddam Hussein after Iraq invaded Kuwait. During the war, the coalition absolutely destroyed Saddam's forces, and President Bush called on the Iraqi military to overthrow Saddam as he feared that Iran would benefit from the changes of imbalance of power, and that if the coalition went on the way on their own, then they would be responsible for rebuilding and occupying Iraq as well as spawning resentment throughout the region. However, the uprisings were misunderstood by the Iraqis, who believed that US tanks would roll into Baghdad and have their backs the whole time. Regardless, the Gulf War left the US on a high as the Cold War ended. The post-Cold War era lasted from 1992 to 2001 and is considered the golden age for American image and the spread of democracy around the world. Humanitarian interventions and actions were led by the US, such as no-fly zones enacted on Ba'athist Iraq. However, this period also saw some of the most violent conflicts since World War II during the Clinton administration. One region that was heavily impacted by the end of the Cold War was Afghanistan, which saw 3 civil wars throughout the post-Cold War era. The first one lasted from 1989 to 1992 and concluded in the Mujahideen defeating the DRA. The second one lasted from 1992 to 96 and was immediately after the first one, and it saw a Taliban victory. The third civil war of the 1990s lasted from 1996 to 2001 and was inconclusive but ended with the American invasion following the 9/11 terrorist attacks. During the time of these 3 wars, the US supported the Mujahideen and moderate factions during the first civil war. However, at the end of the Cold War, the US remained out of the conflict, and therefore Pakistan, the Saudis, and Iran did their thing in intervening and supporting factions that they supported in the next 2 civil wars. The Yugoslav wars brought some of the fiercest fighting to Europe that the Europeans had ever seen since World War II. During the violent political breakup of the country, only Slovenia was able to become independent relatively unscathed. Massive ethnic cleansing and genocide occurred, as did genocide against the various regions of the populations of Yugoslavia, and there were many massacres that tore the region completely apart. It was an absolute bloodbath. The UN did little to enforce international rules or protect victims who were the targets of ethnic cleansing by paramilitary groups and for refugees. Basically, the UN pretty much sat there and did nothing when thousands were massacred by paramilitaries within their own protection zones. The UN also had little enforcement mechanisms. NATO interventions occurred throughout the Yugoslav wars, and bombing operations were successful in getting some of the various factions to come to the negotiating table, and then it resulted in the signing of the Dayton Accords in 1995. There's a whole lot more to the Yugoslav wars and various factions, but I'm not trying to start World War III by going into depth and breaking down what happened in the Balkans. But the point is that in the unipolar world, the US and NATO were able to do what the UN could not. The Kosovo War was preceded by the Kosovo insurgency, which occurred after the Dayton Accords and lasted from 1995 to 1998. The Kosovo War erupted in February of 1998 and continued until the next year in 1999. During the war, NATO intervened and bombed the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia in 1999, and Russian and Ukrainian volunteers also came to fight in Kosovo. The 1990s in Russia was one of the most disastrous decades in Russian history, as it was marked with massive corruption, mafia, open activity, and the rise of the oligarchs who took advantage of shock therapy through scams. Shock therapy in the 90s was also a time of broken dreams and mass disillusionment for the Russian population. Lots of political violence occurred in the 90s under Yeltsin's drunk administration. Also, shock therapy was the vast change to capitalism, and it was marked with massive corruption in the post-communist system. The First Chechen War also occurred from 1994 to 1996 and lasted almost 2 years. This war was a disaster for Yeltsin's administration and for Russian military morale. Somalia and Rwanda both saw humanitarian interventions to very different degrees. The U.S. and UN intervention came into Somalia in Operation Restore Hope during the last days of the H.W. Bush administration, commissioned as a U.S.-led UN-sanctioned Unified Task Force, or UNITAF. The United Nations Operation Somalia 1, or UNISOM 1, had previously been formed in April of 1992 and was ineffective at enforcing a ceasefire until the U.S. offered military support in November of 1992 and UNITAF took over the responsibilities of UNISOM 1. Somalia became stable and order was restored until UNITAF transferred to UNISOM 2 under the presidency of Bill Clinton, and most military forces withdrew, which resulted in warlords taking advantage of the UN peacekeeping forces. However, due to warlord Mohammed Fatah Aidid being himself and acting the way he did, Rangers, Deltas, and other USSF units were deployed in August of 1993 by Clinton in Task Force Ranger as part of Operation Gothic Serpent, with the goal of capturing Aidid. The Black Hawk Down incident during the Battle of Mogadishu ended Operation Gothic Serpent and saw a Task Force Ranger withdraw. UNISOM 2 was a failure and concluded in 1995. Gothic Serpent and UNISOM 2's failure as a whole served to show that in the unipolar world, the U.S. was not willing to pay the price for humanitarian interventions. The Somalia case shows why the U.S. and UN did not militarily intervene in the Rwandan Civil War and subsequent genocide in 1994. Other conflicts such as the First and Second Congo Wars, which are known as the African World Wars, where most of the world remained out of the conflicts as the African continent experienced massive conflicts and casualties. Basically, the world looked at humanitarian interventions as a lost cause and decided that they would stay out of it unless they were NATO in the 1990s in Yugoslavia. The global war on terrorism era began on September 11th with the Al-Qaeda terrorist attack on the U.S., and the war was global as the war had theaters in the Atlantic, Pacific, Middle East, Europe, Asia, and Africa. The war on terror is still ongoing in some places of the world, and terrorist groups are still very active. But the main phase of the war on terror took place from 2001 until 2021 with the disastrous withdrawal from Kabul. Operation Enduring Freedom took place in Afghanistan, the Philippines, Caribbean and Central America, Somalia and the Horn of Africa, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, and the Sahara Desert. Just as a heads up, there are a lot of overlap in this era, and I'm going to discuss things on a case-by-case basis and jump around rather than go in a chronological order during the global war on terrorism. The war in Afghanistan is seen as the main focal point for the war on terror, as Al-Qaeda had refuge from the Taliban. The invasion, Operations Enduring Freedom, and Freedom Sentinel, as well as the fall of Kabul, are the four main events of the war. The war also was not just a U.S. invasion and was a NATO operation, which included other states such as Iran and Pakistan to their own extents. After Kabul fell, the Afghan Republicans and NRF maintained an insurgency against the Taliban. The war in Afghanistan has so much to it which I would like to talk about in future videos. Russia and the U.S. were allies during the War on Terror to an extent which I'll pick up on soon. But during the insurgency phase of the Second Chechen War, Russia was fighting against terrorism. Putin rose to greater prominence by waging and winning the main phase of the Second Chechen War quickly from 1999 to 2000, and the insurgency phase lasting until 2009. Chechnya is currently under the control of Putin puppet Ramzan Kadyrov, who is a fanatical Putin loyalist and authoritarian warlord. But the point is that as a result of the horrors of the 90s in Russia, Putin came to power and got himself some quick and early victories. Iraq had endured sanctions under the Clinton administration since the early 90s and by 2003 had completely destroyed the country. In 2002, Congress gave President George W. Bush the ability to declare war on Iraq, but the invasion came in 2003 under the suspicion that Saddam Hussein still had WMDs using faulty intelligence and the fact that Saddam liked to prevent UN inspections and liked to play a game of saying, do I or do I not have WMDs? And George Bush decided to call Saddam's bluff. The US led a coalition of Britain, Australia, and Poland to invade Iraq. This was not a NATO operation and soured relations between the US and other states, but in the unipolar world, no one was in much of a place to challenge the singular global superpower, especially when the global hegemon of the United States was going in to overthrow the dictator Saddam Hussein. The Iraq War greatly increased the need for counterinsurgency measures within not just American military forces, but other militaries across the world. Iraq saw a civil war spawn in 2006 from the escalating insurgency and ethnic violence between Shia and Sunni groups, which came about from the sanctions of the 90s. The U.S. responded with the troop surge, which ended the Iraqi civil war in 2008 and temporarily stabilized the country. The U.S. exited Iraq in 2011, but the roots of ISIS remained in a growing insurgency that exploded in 2013 and created the war in Iraq from 2013 to 2017. Something else to note is that the UN and multinational force Iraq also participated in the Iraq War after the invasion and during the insurgency phase and civil war. There are many other countries that were present in Iraq other than the United States, Britain, Australia, and Poland. Like the war in Afghanistan, there's so much more to the Iraq War and war in Iraq that I'd love to discuss in future videos, as this is an oversimplification of the conflict. Russian revisionism officially began in March of 2004 as a result of the fifth NATO enlargement, as Putin felt that the US had violated the verbal agreement to not enlarge NATO during the end of the Cold War. The first major confrontation that came as a result of Russian revisionism and Putin's fears of further NATO expansion was the Russo-Georgian War of August 2008, and it had lasted for 16 days. Putin also viewed the Orange Revolution in Ukraine of 2004 as well as the Maidan uprising from 2013 to 2014 as created by the US, even though neither were. Anti-Americanism also spawned in Russia from 2004 to the present day as a result of the greatly accelerated color revolutions in former Soviet socialist republics, where protesters demanded greater freedoms from their authoritarian pro-Russian governments in the early 2000s. The Arab Spring came in 2011 and saw massive protests and demand for democracy in the Middle East and North Africa. Some were violently suppressed and others saw democratization and concessions from the authoritarian regime. However, one notable case of the Arab Spring was the start of the Syrian Civil War and another being the start of the Libyan Civil Wars. Additionally, the Middle East had been and currently in 2024 is still experiencing the Saudi-Iranian and Israeli-Iranian proxy conflicts, which capitalized on the Arab Spring and other civil conflicts. Other very and violent methods of political conflict and extremism also spawned from the Arab Spring. This was the Arab Winter, which is ongoing in some areas and has included civil wars, insurgencies, and other methods of violent extremism and terrorism. A second Arab Spring began in 2018 and is ongoing with different results by state. Operation Inherent Resolve was launched in 2014 to combat ISIS in Iraq, Syria, and Libya. In Iraq, Iran seized the opportunity to heavily increase its influence in the country with the Popular Mobilization Forces and the IRGC advisors. In Syria, Russia backed the Assad regime, while the U.S. supported SDF and Turkey backed the opposition. In the first Libyan civil war in 2011, NATO and other states supported anti-Gaddafi forces against the dictator. In the second Libyan civil war from 2014 to 2020, the Tobruk and Tripoli-based governments received support from NATO states and anti-NATO states alike, creating a very weird geopolitical situation. Back to Russia, Crimea was annexed by the Russians in 2014 and the Donbass War kicked off in the same year. Operation Atlantic Resolve was military activities by NATO states in response to the Russian involvement in Ukraine. Atlantic Resolve was meant to deter Russia, and it was followed by Operation Dragoon Ride in 2015. Russian PMCs have also been very active in Africa, acting as Russia's principal agents. Also, most PMCs are businesses and make private agreements with authoritarian regimes to deal with their security problems in exchange for resource mines. With the U.S. considered a falling or stagnant hegemon, China has seized the opportunity to increase and expand their influence as a rising power. There are many land disputes between China and its neighbors, as well as much competition with the United States on the geopolitical stage. China's Belt and Road Initiative and other soft power measures are a global power play move. Debt trap diplomacy has also been a method for China to gain unwilling allies as when poor countries cannot pay back Chinese loans, China is allowed to operate state-owned Chinese PMCs and have access to military bases in exchange for that country's debt when they cannot pay China back. Other soft power measures have been to give large sums of cash in exchange for states no longer recognizing Taiwan. Additionally, while U.S. military aid has conditions in countries like Pakistan, Chinese military aid can be used for pretty much anything. Post-global war on terrorism challenges to U.S. hegemony in the 2022 to present day is still happening, but that doesn't mean that there's nothing to make of it regarding the unipolar world. The Russian invasion of Ukraine rallied most of the world against Russian revisionism and has been a big win for the United States regarding competition with Russia. But due to this, Russia has also strengthened greater ties with authoritarian rulers, such as those in the West African Coup Belt region, and has gotten even closer with China, even though the two are only united against the United States, as both Russia and China have competing interests. Other threats remain prevalent to challenging the U.S.-led world as America's hegemony is being chipped away at constantly and exponentially being challenged. Venezuela's moves towards the Essequibo region of Guyana, Serbia's recent eyeballing of Kosovo, the war in Sudan, the creation of the Coup Belt, increasing strength of Mexican cartels, and with some having ties to China and many more geopolitical messes are all threats that the U.S. is having to meet and maintain in the unipolar and post-global war on terrorism world. The U.S. is still the current global hegemon as of 2024, but it appears to be falling as China is rising and Russia is in a revisionist state, wanting to be a superpower once again. It's unknown what the future holds in terms of international affairs, and will the world remain in a unipolar world? Will we return to a bipolar or multipolar world with the normalization of larger and more powerful states invading smaller and less powerful states? Only time will tell, but let me know in the comments if you would like videos on any of these major case studies or others which I left out for time reasons. Also, let me know if you have any questions or things that you want cleared up in the comments below, as this has been a very brief summary of the modern warfare phases. And thank you for watching.